The Buhari's administration is walking a very tightrope at the moment when it comes to the issue of tax. Yes, the government needs more tax, so that is one policy being pursued aggressively. But on the other hand, the presidency is also, or the government is also reducing tax to ease the burden on Nigerians and ease those who want to do business. So it's a very delicate balancing, as it were. Of course, that's how the finance minister put it yesterday at the end of the Federal Executive Council meeting, announcing those two executive orders on tax approved by and signed on by the president. And of course, those new proposals that includes those for the medium and small enterprises. Let's bring Nigeria's tax oracle. We'll call him the oracle of the tax system. Yomi Olugbenro is a partner and West Africa tax leader at Deloitte, Nigeria. Good morning, Mr. Ogbenro. It's good to have you.
Good morning, Boston. Good morning, Nigerians.
Thank you. This is a very interesting day for these announcement of executive orders. Take us through it.
All right. Thank you so much again, Boston, for having me. You'll recall that last year, specifically on the 1st of February 2017, the Federal Executive Council approved a new national tax policy for the country. And the aim of that new policy is to make the system of tax a lot more entrenched, simplify the system, and see how we can grow our non-oil tax revenue. So subsequent to that, towards the later part of the year, another committee was put together by the federal government, the National Tax Policy Implementation Committee. So the mandate of that committee was to look at the national tax policy and make recommendations to the government on changes that could be made, especially if you like the low-hanging fruit. So they were meant to look at the ARUGP, the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, and also the Ease of Doing Business initiative that the government is embarking upon, and to recommend some key initiatives that could be immediately implemented. So the committee submitted its report earlier this year, I think around February, to the Minister of Finance. And what has happened yesterday is that the recommendation had now been approved by the Federal Executive Council. So there were two broad categories of recommendation. Again, the context is what can we do immediately? What can we implement? The low-hanging fruit. So the more fundamental changes can come up later on in the country. So two executive orders were recommended. One to make some changes to the Value-Added Tax Act, and the second one is to review the list of goods that are liable to excise duty. So those were the two executive orders. They also made proposals touching on 5 other different legislations, but that is supposed to come by way of changes in the National Assembly. So 5 amendment bills were also recommended, and those 5 were also approved. So those were the one relating to the company income tax, the one relating to custom and excise as well, personal income tax, and some other legislation like the education tax and the pioneer legislation. So broadly, that's the way it is. So, but I think the one, yeah.
Let's take this very quickly and break it down because of time. The value-added tax relates to residential property, lease on rentals. Do you see this as a low-hanging fruit? If I'm no longer going to pay VAT on residential property, public transportation, and things like that?
Yes, I think it is. The challenge we've had with our VAT law is that the way the law was constructed just made virtually everything that is not specifically listed as not liable to VAT as covered under that law. So you have services such as insurance, public transportation, like you did mention, covered because they were not originally specifically exempted. So what the new executive order has done is to say if you are involved in public transport services, or you're paying life insurance premium or commission related to that, or residential property, for example, you will no longer be required to pay VAT. So that's some extra pocket for Nigerians.
I like that. If I'm no longer going to be charged VAT for my life insurance. And then on residential property, how does this, how will that play? The removal of VAT on residential property?
All right, so, I mean, ordinarily, if an individual is taking out lease, and paying lease renter or renters, as we call it. You're renting out a property for your own personal use, for residential purposes. Prior to this law, the landlord is ordinarily expected to include 5% VAT on the cost of the rent that you're being charged. So what's happening now is that that's no longer there. So if you leasing out a property that is 200,000 naira per annum, 500,000 or #1,000,000 naira, that would have been increased by an extra 5% prior to this executive order. But that extra tax burden had now been removed.
Great news. Great news. I'm going to ask my landlord about that. Later today, I just wanted you to clarify that before I put a call through to him and say, hey, next rent, 5% minus. I'll do the calculation myself and I just hand him over the balance. I hand the balance over to him. That looks like something 180 million Nigerians would love to hear. That sounds like good music to the ears. But the other executive order, expand that to us.
Okay, so maybe particularly the one that would be of interest are some of the amendments coming on the Companies Income Tax Act, particularly those relating to micro, small, and medium enterprises, those relating to companies that do group structure, and also companies in the insurance business. So, I will mention them briefly. So on the Companies Income Tax, presently, micro, small, and medium enterprises are subject to tax at a reduced rate of 20% compared with 30% that large corporates are subject to tax. But the threshold is very small. So the definition of a small business under the old law, it's a company with ⁻1 million naira turnover, which is completely obsolete. So that is being reviewed, has been reviewed now, or is going to be reviewed based on this amendment. And the rate of tax for MSMEs will also be brought down from 20 to 15. So that's some good news for MSMEs. For insurance business, there is an existing restriction that only allows carry forward of losses. If you make loss in your business, you're permitted to recover it from your future profit only within 4 years limitation. But that's no longer going to be there based on this amendment that is being put forward. So you can continue to carry forward your losses until it is fully recovered. What it means in effect is that if you've done badly in earlier years, in the subsequent years, you'll be permitted to recoup some of those losses and by implication reduce your taxes. But I think the one that is going to send some very good news to the large corporates is the Section 19, or what we call the dividend tax rule, that's also being reviewed at the moment. What the rule typically means is that many of the companies that are listed on the exchange end up paying taxes on the amount of dividend that they declare in a year, because what the rule says is that if the total dividend you are declaring is more than your annual taxable profit, then the company will charge you 30% on your dividend that is declared. And I can count many listed companies for the past number of years that I can remember have been paying taxes based on dividends, because the dividend declared is usually much higher, than the taxable profit. But that is now being amended such that if there's an evidence that you've paid taxes on the retained earnings that you then distributing to shareholders in subsequent years, you will no longer be required to pay tax on that extra dividend that you're declaring. And I think that's going to be very huge for the businesses that are listed on the exchange.
Are you telling me, Yomi, it's going to be good news? I'm sure the stock exchange, the shareholders associations, and the company's executive will be pouring over that this morning and use the calculators. They all have their calculators right now, looking at how much in hundreds of millions and billions of naira the Buhari's administration by this act is now pushing back to them, put it back in their coffers and helping their business to grow. Now, put overall, and we're going to come back to this maybe in the days and weeks ahead, trying to digest a little bit more. I'm sure you heard the finance minister yesterday says that, and I'm going to quote very quickly, you're listening to this. He says, in the short term, of course, that means a revenue lost for the government. But we think in the long run, that is the right thing to do in improving ease of doing business and reducing the tax burden on our people, which is really one of the objectives of this government. This is a very tightrope that this administration is walking, isn't it?
Well, that's correct, but ultimately, I think the economy benefits ultimately. So if you put some extra disposable income in the pocket of individual, that's some extra cushion to the austerity that many of them have faced in the past number of years, and ultimately that ended up being plowed back into the economy, and you can just increase, by the multiplier effect in the economy. And the same with the business. So if businesses are growing and they are coughing out so much in taxes, whatever is available to be retained can be plowed back into the business by way of retained earnings or paid out to shareholders who can also be engaged in other form of business or economic activity. So there are several jurisdictions where taxes can be used deliberately to appear to have caused some bit of short-term shock to the revenue of the government, but the multiplier effect in the economy is what ultimately I think the country will benefit from, and I see that happening a lot.
This is stimulating the country's economy on one hand. I'm sure you agree. Again, if you allow companies to extend without any particular sunset when it comes to what they are in the past, that's keeping more companies in business longer than if they would have folded up under the weight of tax.
Absolutely, that's very true. That's very true, and you need a lot of that. Yes, we've passed through recession, but you know that there's still a huge gap for the need to keep stimulating the economy and all of that. So whatever is available to individuals and businesses is going to go a long way in helping to pump in a lot more into the economic activity in the country, and just for us to be on the right trajectory as we desire.
And let's see how it goes up from here. I'm sure on Twitter, on social media, this is already being fed. Folks are getting a little bit, well, at least happy that there'll be no VAT on public transport owners. Maybe some folks will be thinking of getting into that business. Or perhaps it will reduce the cost of transportation. If the VAT is not being passed on to me, I'm going to find out from the bus stops or the motor parks in the next days ahead. Thank you very much. Yomi Olugbenro, partner and head of West Africa Tax Matters at Deloitte, Nigeria.